All right, friends and comrades, welcome back. Daniel Tudd here with Emancipations podcast. Very pleased to welcome Paul Heideman, historian who has completed his PhD at Rutgers in American Studies. And Paul, I've known about your work for quite a while. It's great to have you on the show. Your work has appeared in Jacobin, Dissent magazine in these times, and your latest book is quite remarkable, I must say. Its title is called Rogue Elephant: How the Republicans Went from the Party of Business to the Party of Chaos. And I was very moved by reading this in the sense that I feel like so much of the chaos of the Republican Party has prevented us on the left from having a sort of rational, kind of clear assessment of the historical situation and also it sort of clouds our capacity to discern the reality of American politics. And so your story in this book really starts with, I would say, this sort of disillusion of the New Deal in a certain way. I mean, you take it back. It's, in a sense, it's a focus on the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party, you learn a lot about the Democratic Party throughout the book as well. So, first of all, congrats for writing this, and it's with
Thanks so
Verso
much.
Books. Yeah, it's with Verso, which is obviously a very important left-wing publisher. We have a link to it in the show notes. I hope everybody buys it. Paul, let us begin with an understanding of why you wanted to write Rogue Elephant, just to begin with here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Daniel. So most of my career as a writer has actually been spent as a historian of the American left, not the right. That's most of my writing for Jacobin has been on that front, and that's what my PhD was on. But particularly in the wake of January 6, 2021, it became clear that something really kind of unusual was going on in the Republican Party, and that there needed to be a real explanation of it that wasn't simply grounded in kind of familiar stories about various kinds of reaction, the power of various kinds of reactionary ideologies. That there was really an institutional and structural transformation that had been underway, and so the book began as an attempt to kind of trace that history of how the party had changed. And in doing so, I found that it was really based in two larger transformations of American society, basically since the 1970s, which were the weakening of political parties as institutions in the United States and the disorganization of the capitalist class, both of which were processes that had longer term roots in American society, but that acquired kind of new potency in the decades since the 1970s, and which I think are indispensable for understanding the various pathologies of the Republican Party.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. So I feel like in some sense for a lot of us on the left, it seems a bit strange to see a Republican Party which is actually in opposition to big business.
Yeah.
That's a little odd. Um, I mean, obviously, when we were younger, at least speaking for myself, like George Bush the first was president,
Mhm.
and he was always very copacetic to big business. It seemed like that was what it meant to be a Republican, right? It's pretty simple. And in a way, you could say that that alignment created order and predictability and a lack of chaos. And so that's a very interesting thesis that you develop, is that the chaos is actually born from the right wing breaking from business. Now, the story you tell about this revolves around the Chamber of Commerce movement, the kind of, frankly, I would say, the origin of neoliberalism, the collapse of of organized labor,
Mhm.
and how there becomes this very interesting, almost like dialectic between the Republican Party and the interests of business. And you call it the fractured elite.
Mhm.
Can you tell us about this thesis of the fractured elite? And do you agree that this is counterintuitive?
Yes,
This
yeah, and
idea.
I think particularly for those of us on the left, we often tend to adopt a mental model in which capital either A, simply doesn't need to organize, or B, is always organized and always incredibly kind of well represented politically. But in fact, I think the degree to which the capitalist class is organized varies historically within a given country in different periods and varies quite a bit across countries in the degree to which the capitalist class is kind of has institutions dedicated to producing class-wide consensus on various issues and mobilizing the class for the achievement of that consensus. And I think in the United States, business has been much less organized than elsewhere, which is very different from saying they haven't been dominant. In fact, it is precisely because their dominance has been less challenged in the United States than in much of Western Europe, say, that capital has not needed to be as organized in order to maintain their dominance in the United States. They can be dominant while disorganized. And so this was quite clear in, say, the early 20th century in the United States, where the union movement in the United States was not as strong or aggressive as in kind of similar capitalist countries, and you didn't see the kind of institutionalization of a workers' party in the United States the way you saw elsewhere. And because of all this, capital didn't need to kind of come together, work out some kind of class-wide to consensus to come to the field of battle. They were able to win their battles on kind of a one-by-one basis. Um, and this only intensified after World War II, when you had the development of like corporatism in Northern and Western Europe to various degrees that really institutionalized, like, okay, capital is going to come to the negotiating table and present their position. And in order for them to do that, they need to be organized in order to come up with a position. So in the United States, you don't get any of that. In the United States, you get various business organizations like the Chamber of Commerce you mentioned, the National Association of Manufacturers. You could add the Committee for Economic Development in the mid 20th century, all of which were very, very important and very powerful organizations, but none of which ever came close to representing business in kind of a class-wide position. All of them represented kind of small fractures, small pieces of the business class, the ownership class. And so you have plenty of business organizations in American history, but you don't have the kind of what we might call like peak level encompassing business organizations that become typical, certainly in Western Europe after World War II. In the United States, you don't really see that. So it is precisely because capital has been so dominant in the United States that they haven't needed to be disorganized. It's a consequence of American exceptionalism.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the story you tell, could you give us this sort of starting perhaps with Nixon and
Mhm.
then moving on up to Reagan? Tell us about how this fracturing begins to take place within the Republican Party.
Mhm.
And obviously, this reaches a crescendo with Newt Gingrich and the Newt Gingrich Revolution, which you spend a lot of time talking about. And of course, my father was a Rush Limbaugh listener, so I remember the Newt Gingrich Revolution, unfortunately, as a young person listening to. And I do remember that that was the moment at which American politics took on
Mhm.
um, a chaotic vibe and strategy and tactic. We'll get to Newt Gingrich in a moment, but maybe you could kind of retell that history of how this kind of all, in a way, sort of dissolves. And interestingly, I mean, you could even start with McCarthy, which
Mhm.
you open as in comparison to Donald Trump. So take that as you will.
So yeah, to begin with McCarthy. So McCarthy is a figure who's somewhat similar to Trump in some ways. Who brings no small amount of chaos into politics and is a right wing demagogue. And like Trump, McCarthy really started going after some of the central institutions of American elite power, in McCarthy's case, namely the Army. And as he did so, he produced a very strong backlash among the leaders of some of the biggest corporations in the United States. Not because they were concerned about anti-communism. They thought, in fact, the problem was that McCarthy was discrediting anti-communism. And so they organized
because it was
to
too extreme. It
yeah,
was too
and
extreme.
undisciplined, irresponsible, and not aimed at the right targets. They didn't want the army being investigated for communists. That's not where they thought the fight was. Um, and so they wanted they wanted the unions broken. That's fundamentally what they wanted. Um, and they organized both in the Senate and putting pressure on the Eisenhower administration to kind of coalesce a backlash against McCarthy that eventually results in McCarthy being censured, which completely destroys his career, and he's basically friendless in the Senate for a few years after that, until he dies, really. Um, and so that's an underappreciated, I think, part of the McCarthy story, that his downfall was really centrally a result of organizing by American capitalists who thought he needed to be brought in under control. Um, and I think the 70s are a moment where you see an even greater degree of unity among the capitalist class in response to the various kind of crises that decade, from the wildcat kind of union movement of the late 60s and early 70s, to inflation, to the agitation for consumer protection and the new wave of regulation like OSHA and the EPA, and the general kind of international economic turbulence of those years. In response to all of this, there's a move by American capitalists to organize themselves precisely as a class. And this is the language they use. They say, we need to organize not as individual businesses, but as a class to present our demands and to press our demands on the state. And this is where you get the formation of the Business Roundtable. The Business
Right.
Roundtable, which was to be an organization of the 500, I think 500 or so largest CEOs of the largest American corporations, and they form. Again, with the explicit goal of representing not a section of business, not a certain ideological current within business, but business as a class. And over the course of the 70s, they really win a number of stunning political victories at a time when people thought, in the first couple of years of the Carter administration, that we would see kind of a continuation of the Great Society, right? That this continued expansion of the welfare state and of major transformational victories for kind of the liberal labor coalition, as it was called. So on things like full employment, consumer protection, labor law reform, all of which in the aftermath of Watergate and the Carter's election, Democrats seemed totally teed up to achieve. All of them are defeated by this wave of business mobilization. And the kind of liberal democratic advocates for these policies are just stunned by the power that business is now exerting in this very direct way. And of course, as Carter's administration flounders, partially as a result of its inability to achieve any reforms for people, you get the Reagan administration, and Reagan is so solicitous to business and so aggressive in attacking its enemies in the labor movement that what you start to see during like Reagan's first tax bill is a breakdown of this kind of class-wide organization as businesses figure out that the Reagan administration is so eager to give them what they want, they don't have to restrict themselves to those demands which are capable of maintaining kind of wide consensus in the class. They can, business can really push for those things that'll benefit their sector or their firm individually. And so, like David Stockman, Reagan's budget director, says it was like pigs feeding at the trough, right? All these corporations are just like, we want this tax exemption, we want this accelerated depreciation allowance, all these kind of, arcane minutia of tax bills is directed towards giving everything to business. And this breakdown of business unity results in a bill that is a massive increase in the deficit during peacetime, which is kind of unprecedented at that time. And then it results actually in Reagan needing to pass one of the largest peacetime tax hikes in history in order to repair that. And by this time, business is falling out over, how is this deficit going to be repaired? Who's going to pay for it? Business unity has really broken down. And at the same time, the fact that Reagan is still so eager to give business everything it wants means that groups like the Chamber of Commerce start saying, we're having trouble selling memberships because people are like, well, Reagan's in office. Why do I need you? Why do I need you to lobby for anything when Reagan's already going to give us everything we want? So you really see over from the 70s to the 80s, you see this kind of moment of unity of American business and organization, a really high point for the organization. And then under Reagan, as business's dominance is reasserted and reestablished, you see the fracturing of that unity.
Very interesting. So I do want to ask how the Democrats become, I mean, we have what's generally in the academic literature called like the third way movement of Clinton and Blair, which seems to represent the Democrats making a kind of tectonic shift back to a corporate friendly foothold, and all of the international trade agreements that they sign into, and globalization, quote unquote, is essential here. But are you kind of suggesting that at least in this first consolidation of the Chamber of Commerce movement and this organization of the business class, that the Republican Party largely were the beneficiaries of that organization? When did the Democrats come around to that, if that makes sense?
I mean, Carter is not a radical, certainly. And the Democrats had always had support from elements of big business, at times considerable support. I mean, in 1964, Goldwater gets very, very little support from big business in the United States. He has a lot of support from kind of small and medium business, where John Birch Society ideology is rampant. And, it's not widely appreciated that Goldwater was a fervent protectionist. He's so associated with libertarianism, but he was actually a very strong protectionist, and the kind of small and medium-sized businesses of the 60s were into that. But big business as a whole wanted nothing to do with him. Johnson, carried big business massively in 64. But over the course of the 70s, there is a shift to the right in the business class that leads them ultimately to Reagan in 1980, who they're very happy with. And so this, it's certain that the organization of business in the 70s certainly results in a defeat for the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, absolutely. And the immediate beneficiary is the right wing of the Republican Party. Over the course of the 80s, the Democrats attempt to chase this in various ways. I mean, Walter Mondale in 84 runs on the platform of deficit reduction, which somehow fails to win anything remotely like a popular majority. Right.
Well, that was the same year as Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition as well.
Yes. So you have this challenge inside the Democratic Party, but the kind of party as a whole goes from Mondale to Dukakis, who's also a very pro.
And they were all so they were all corporate Democrats. The Democratic Party always had a foothold in business, but from the point of view of the organization of the business class, they didn't really see the Democratic Party as their immediate part. Okay.
No.
That would
the Democrats were the B team at this time.
I think that's interesting. I think the other thing there, of course, that I want to ask you to talk about is how the Democratic Party's nucleus of organization that you talk about towards the end of your book as being driven by and coordinated by interest groups, special interest groups, various ethnic, not so much religious, but identity groups and so on. That forms the cohesion of the Democratic Party. That's not the basis of the cohesion of the Republican Party, and in a way, that gives the Republican Party a lot more leverage for Trump to step in and
Yes.
take over. Can you explain those two kind of organizing logics
Mhm.
of the two dominant parties?
Yeah, so the Democratic Party, as it evolved in really the second half of the 20th century, evolved to be a kind of collection of interest groups. So you have labor, you have African Americans, you have women's organizations, right? Those are some of the biggest. But in the development of the 90s, you get like gay rights organizations as well, coming to be quite important. And so there's been some very good scholarship on this. That if you look at like how Democrats run primary campaigns for president, they run them on the basis of I'm going to do this for this group, and I'm going to do this for this group, and I'm going to do this for this group. There's kind of a distributive logic to politics of like, here's how I'm going to kind of please all the groups that make up this party. In the Republican Party since the 70s, what you've seen instead has been a much more focus on ideology, on proving I am the most conservative in the party. That's why you should vote for me, right? Democrats have not, by and large, run primaries on the basis of I'm the most liberal, right? Vote for me. Whereas Republicans absolutely run on I'm the most conservative, vote for me. Instead, Democrats run on their ability to serve the various interest groups, bring them together, kind of get something for everybody, etc. And I do think that this has inhibited kind of political polarization in the Democratic Party, right? Like the fact that you don't have people trying to outdo themselves with "I'm the most liberal," right? Like, no, actually, I'm more liberal. You don't have this kind of runaway logic that you do see in the Republican Party of people constantly trying to prove that they're more liberal than, or sorry, more conservative than the people who came before them. So in the Republicans, you have Gingrich coming up saying we need to be more conservative, we need to fight, and then you have a generation that comes up after him being like, no, 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 Gingrich isn't really conservative. We're the real conservatives.
Right. Right. So that's very fascinating. And I do want to get at a later point in this conversation to talking about how the Democratic Party coalitional model that you just articulated is actually something that prevents socialists and breakaway figures like Bernie Sanders from actually having success within the Democratic Party.
Mhm.
But before we get to that, can I invite you to talk about the John Birch Society and its ideological agenda? Because I don't know how many people are aware of it, but it's an
Yeah.
extremely important uh, sort of anti-communist, radical conservative ideological movement. Many have associated it with a version of American fascism. I wonder if you think that's
Mhm.
accurate, but its sort of ripple effects have long tentacles. It
Yeah.
reaches far, I would claim. Even in Reaganism you see a lot of these
Yeah.
ideas there. And what's so interesting though is that like for socialists, like ideology is the name of our game in a certain way, right? And the Democratic Party has kind of kneecapped that capacity, but in the Republican Party that's not the case.
Mhm.
Obviously, as socialists, it doesn't make sense for us to go work with the Republican Party. That wouldn't quite work. However, talk about these extreme right wing ideologies, starting with Birch, and then I want to build up to Gingrich as well.
Yeah, the roots of kind of far right ideology in the United States go back very far. You could trace them to Reconstruction and the kind of counter-revolutionary mobilization against interracial democracy in the South. That was one version. In the teens and 20s, you had the kind of revived KKK in the United States, this kind of far right anti-immigrant ideology, the ideology of 100% Americanism, the first Red Scare, the Palmer raids, all of this is the kind of deep well from which the American far right can draw. And in the mid 20th century, the John Birch Society was probably the most influential manifestation of this. It was founded, I think, in the early 50s by an American manufacturer who actually sat on the board of the National Association of Manufacturers, who was a figure with some heft in the world of business and politics. And it was named after an American missionary who had died in China, and was this anti-communist group that probably first really came to prominence in accusing the Eisenhower administration of harboring communists in the 1950s, and really much of like the what we think of as the 20th century right, now from National Review, William F. Buckley, John Birch Society, etc., really came about in the crucible of republicanism, of modern republicanism during the Eisenhower administration. That was what kind of Eisenhower and his associates in the Republican Party called their ideology. This kind of attempt to make peace with the New Deal to a degree, right? To recognize that you weren't going to turn the clock back, and so you could stop the expansion of the welfare state and of labor, but there was not the time to try and turn the clock back. And various groups said, no, actually it is, and set about organizing that. And the John Birch Society was probably the most extravagant of these, with its accusations that Eisenhower was.
So sorry, one clarification.
Yeah.
So Birch Society was to the right of William F. Buckley.
Yes.
By far. So
and in fact, Buckley, famously kind of excommunicated them from the right as kind of the irresponsible right that he wanted nothing to do with.
So how did their extreme positions sort of manifest or appear like to people, and to what extent did they have any popular buy-in, or does that make sense? Like how did this extremist ideology end up becoming a major plank of Ronald Reagan's worldview?
Yeah.
How did that work?
Yeah, I mean, there were millions of Americans who agreed with the John Birch Society in the 1950s, right? There were certainly huge numbers of people who agreed that the communist conspiracy was everywhere. I mean, more broadly, the John Birch Society was kind of a punchline in American culture in a lot of ways. Bob Dylan wrote talking John Birch paranoid blues, right? And kind of jokes about them were quite common. Their paranoia was easy to mock. But they kept organizing, and Buckley's kind of attempt to read them out of the right and say, this is not the kind of right we want. This kind of conspiracism is not what we're interested in. That sort of quarantine action ultimately failed. And though I think elements of that ideology proved useful and attractive to various political entrepreneurs on the right over the subsequent decades, such that, by the time you get the Reagan administration, the kind of extremism of Reaganite anti-communism and administration figures like Richard Pipes and people around that in the Reagan administration who basically wanted to nuke the Soviet Union, right? Who nuking the USSR was their kind of ultimate policy goal. That's a Bircher wet dream, right? So I do think that even as elements of the right attempted to set themselves off from the Birchers, they were invigorated by aspects of kind of Bircher fantasy life, like this idea of destroying the USSR militarily.
So Newt Gingrich is probably not talked about too much. I think you make a nice quote from E.P. Thompson that social movements have a 6-year lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because like Karl Rove, Newt Gingrich, major figures of our youth. And now I wonder if, Gen Z people even know about these people.
Yeah.
I mean, you do make the nice point that when in 2015, 2016, it looked very positive for Donald Trump to be victorious with the Republican Party, he sat down with Karl Rove.
Mm-hmm.
But Gingrich emerges, and I actually would appreciate if you kind of elaborate and spend a little bit of time talking about what the Gingrich Revolution was, how he organized. What I found most interesting was how he organized the communication apparatus of the Republican Party by kind of consolidating it around an ideologically unified agenda. And that was you, at least at a kind of detached point of view, you have to kind of respect the tactics that he developed. It's extremely effective in what he's doing. You talked about how he would generate almost like pre-podcast podcasting,
Yeah.
and right, and like disseminate it out. And I do think probably Limbaugh was probably, I don't know if you mentioned Limbaugh, but I feel like Limbaugh's an important figure there for the Gingrich Revolution from my memory as well. But what was the Gingrich Revolution? Why is it so important as well?
Yeah, so on the most basic level, the Gingrich Revolution was the Republicans taking back the majority in the House of Representatives in the 1994 midterms for the first time in about 50 years. The Republicans had been a minority in the House for 5 decades when Gingrich finally leads them to a majority in '92. And he was the House Minority Leader at that time, and then he became Speaker of the House. So it was really seen as kind of his achievement. And Gingrich was indeed a kind of germinal figure in reorganizing the Republican Party in the '80s and early '90s. And what Gingrich recognized more than anyone else was that politics in the United States had become even more centered on finance and collecting money than it had been previously. Money's always been a big role in American politics, but um, in the 1970s, as campaigning shifted from a kind of door to door in person activity to one that was carried out primarily through television ads, money replaced labor as kind of the key input in the production of campaign victories. And Gingrich understood this and understood the implications of this. And what he understood was that the person who can be in charge of kind of distributing money throughout the party is the person who will rule the party, regardless of kind of the official kind of leadership positions, things like that. And so in the '80s, Gingrich goes about building this network of campaign finance redistribution and, as you said, kind of ideological training for the Republican Party. He has a institution called GoPac, which was actually a state level PAC in Delaware that he had inherited in kind of a funny way. And kind of the official purpose of GoPac is this kind of ideological training, producing these tapes, like you said, kind of pre-podcasts of Gingrich speaking, which were meant to be listened to by Republican like state level politicians as they're driving around the state, kind of conducting their hearings and meetings and things like that. Gingrich was basically like, people spend a lot of time in the car, and we should use that time. Um, but what was actually even more important than that was that he figured out that by using this network to redistribute money, not directly through the network, but by bringing people in touch with each other, he could become kind of the most powerful person in Republican politics outside the president. Um, so what Gingrich did was not take donations to GoPac and then through GoPac give money to different candidates, but instead use GoPac events to put donors and candidates in the room together to make sure that the candidates who were asking for favors from him and that kind of thing got funded, right? Um, that was how he built this kind of shadow fundraising network that in its extent really started to rival like the official National Republican Campaign Committee. And this is what powers Gingrich's rise to the top of the Republican Party. And once he's there, he remakes the entire party along these lines. So by '94, if you want a position on a committee in Gingrich's Congress, you need to meet certain fundraising goals for the Republican Party, right? Like everything gets structured around this. And the Democrats very quickly copy this in the 1990s when they see how much money is being raised, so that by about the year 2000, in both parties in Congress, there are basically posted prices for committee membership. You want to be on the Senate Banking Committee? Well, that's a very lucrative position. You need to raise a hell of a lot of money for the party if you want to get appointed to that position. And if you don't raise that money, you are not getting that position. So it's an institutional transformation of the parties that Gingrich pioneers by making raising money and redistributing money the kind of sine qua non of political leadership.
And Gingrich also is known, as far as I can tell, as one of the pivotal political figures that introduces this kind of culture within Washington that we are very familiar with
Mhm.
today, of kind of a culture of incivility, kind of culture
Mhm.
of a kind of culture of obstructionism, right? A filibuster of which is really, I think, post ideological. Like, so he's
Mhm.
ideological, but he's not ideological at the level of like democratic deliberation, right?
Mhm.
He actually
Yeah.
wants to. So could you say something about that strategy? What's the logic there? Because again,
Mhm.
this is sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the origin points of your idea of chaos, insofar
Mhm.
as the business community doesn't like that. As far as I can tell, the business community likes stability. They don't
Mhm.
want witch hunts. They don't want a breakdown. They don't want government shutdowns. They don't want government
Right.
shutdown, right? Gingrich, on the other hand, is this kind of master tactician of chaos. Where did he get that idea? And is that true? Is that a true hallmark of the Gingrich Revolution? This introduction of these tactics of obstruction and incivility.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And I mean, funnily enough, Gingrich was inspired by the Viet Cong on this front quite explicitly. Right? He looked at the position of congressional Republicans in the 80s and said, look, we are the minority. We have been in the minority for decades at this point, but we want power. What can we do? Guerrilla warfare will be the strategy. And there are strategy memos where they're literally comparing themselves to the Viet Cong at this point, which is quite funny. Um, but what Gingrich figures out in terms of this guerrilla warfare is that the way to attack the Democrats is not politically on policy. That won't get the Republicans anywhere. The way to attack them is on process and ethics. And so Gingrich begins this kind of campaign of these ethical complaints against the Democratic leadership, and he pushes them hard enough and successfully enough that he's actually able to bring down Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the Speaker of the House in the mid to late 80s, the successor of Tip O'Neill. He gets him to resign basically over these kind of ethics complaints, and this absolutely introduces a new level of kind of incivility and bellicosity into congressional politics. Like that, like Gingrich is very much not behaving like a gentleman in all of this. And so yeah, Gingrich, through this kind of emphasis on like these ethics complaints, this process stuff, Gingrich turns politics into much more of a blood sport. And no, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, obviously, this reaches its high water mark with the impeachment of Bill Clinton,
Yeah.
Lewinsky scandal, Whitewater. What Whitewater? Yeah,
Hmm.
you can tell us about that in a moment. But
Hmm.
um, what I found most interesting about that, by the way, is the role of the tobacco lobby.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I want you to explain that as well. But please finish your thought there first.
So yeah, this then, when Gingrich gains the majority in Congress in '94, he takes these kind of tactics into his position as Speaker, and this is what leads directly to the government shutdowns and of the mid '90s. And actually, when I started this research, I very much expected to find that business was pretty pissed at Gingrich about these shutdowns. And it's not actually what I found. Like the Chamber of Commerce totally praises the congressional Republicans, even after the shutdowns, being like, it was so important that we had this fight. And they lose this fight. The Republicans lose this horribly. Clinton wins. Gingrich is really discredited by it. But still, the Chamber of Commerce is cheering them on. So
Really?
I thought that was, yeah, I thought that was
Huh?
very interesting.
Huh?
Um, then, however, what we get is Clinton moves to the right. And this goes back to what you were talking about kind of
Right.
earlier about the
Third way.
neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party.
Right.
Clinton really moves to the right. And by 96, 98, Clinton is business's best friend in Washington. He's giving them everything they want. The budget is balanced. He gives them this big telecommunications act. He's pushing globalization really hard. He's given them welfare reform. And in fact, now Clinton is talking about privatizing Social Security. He's totally open to the idea.
Prison
Um,
reform. Right.
yeah. Mass incarceration, everything, right? And yet it is at this moment that the Republicans embark on this attempt to have Clinton impeached. At the moment when his support from business has never been stronger, which struck me as a very interesting moment. And what I found was that there was one section of business that really did have reason to want Clinton destroyed in the late 90s, and that was the tobacco industry, because Clinton's FDA had made the move to put tobacco under FDA supervision as a drug. right, to put nicotine specifically as a drug. And for the tobacco industry, this was absolutely disastrous. And it's just worth saying that, like, the tobacco industry, tobacco companies were some of the biggest companies in the U.S. at this point. Like, multiple companies in the Fortune 500 top 10 were tobacco companies. They were really, really huge enterprises. Very, very powerful. And actually, so you have them, they who have the motive to take out Clinton. And when you start looking at the impeachment process, links to tobacco are absolutely everywhere. The main person who was pushing it in the House was Tom DeLay, who was one of Gingrich's lieutenants. And Tom DeLay was extraordinarily close with the tobacco industry. They were one of his very biggest donors. Ken Starr, the independent counsel who investigated Clinton, was working as an attorney representing tobacco clients in lawsuits while working on the Clinton investigation. The kind of appointment of Ken Starr was very closely tied to tobacco politics, and senators from North Carolina played an important role in that whole process. So kind of everywhere you look, you see the tobacco industry's fingerprints on the impeachment at a time when basically no one else among American capitalists was all that unhappy with Bill Clinton, actually. So it's kind of a moment when the Republican Party is able to kind of go rogue to an extent, but they do that because business itself is fractured, and you have this one industry that really, really wants this outcome.
Amazing. Wow. So Gingrich creates this kind of method, this strategy, these series of incivility tactics, which have lived on. It's a kind of pernicious legacy.
Mhm.
And at the same time, um, what I found very interesting, by the way, as we kind of move along chronologically, is that George Bush II,
Mhm.
George Bush Jr., who obviously comes to power in 2000, 2000, 9/11 occurs, etc. But you say his relationship to the business community, on the whole, was actually quite harmonious, or was
Mhm.
sort of sound in a certain way. And
Yeah. Yeah.
why is that? He didn't have the same extreme tactics, although Cheney and Karl Rove
Mhm.
and others probably did. But I was very surprised about your portrayal of Bush II. Could you introduce him into this wider
Yeah.
narrative about the Republican Party? I think we need to introduce Citizens United, how the
Mhm.
how the fundraising is actually modifying at this time as well. But yeah, introduce Bush II, if you would.
Yeah. So Bush comes into this story in some ways in reaction to the increasing incivility and extremism that you see in the Republican Party. So in 1992, famously, Patrick Buchanan had given this speech at the Republican National Convention, which was literally a call for culture war against, feminism and homosexuality, the Enlightenment, all of it. And Bush, who had worked on his father's campaign in '92, really thought that, like, Buchanan's kind of fire breather speech had cost his dad the presidency, had identified the party too much with right wing extremism. And over the course of the '90s, you also get the rise of really nasty xenophobic politics in the Republican Party, particularly in California, with this real attack on Latino immigrants in the Republican Party of California. And Bush comes along as governor of Texas kind of as the antidote to this. Bush is very, very friendly to Latinos in Texas. He actually wins a majority of Latino votes in Texas in his reelection for governor. He gets along well with Democrats. He passes bipartisan legislation. And so Bush's kind of campaign for the Republican nomination in 2000 was in many ways sold as an off ramp from Gingrichism. Like, the slogan of compassionate conservatism that he gets
Right,
identified with is
right,
very purposefully about presenting an image of the Republican Party that is not Newt Gingrich trying to take people's welfare away.
right,
Um, at the same time, however, because Bush is himself a born again Christian and speaks that language, he's able to bring that wing of the party with him, right? Like, that wing of the party doesn't feel like his election is a defeat for them. because, on things like abortion and other kind of social issues, he's very, very much with them. And so Bush is able to bring both wings of the Republican Party together in his presidency. And then 9/11 and the reassertion of kind of American imperial adventurism afterwards is further cementing the unity of the party. And in terms of the relationship with business, what's really interesting is, Bush had campaigned on a tax cut, like a huge tax cut. That had been one of his signature proposals. We're going to do a really big tax cut for Americans. There's a budget surplus. That means we can cut taxes. And business had been overjoyed about this. Business was like, we're going to get this corporate tax cut. It is going to be amazing. And what Bush does at the very beginning of his presidency is he gets all of these heads of business organizations and corporations together, and he says, you are not getting a penny in this tax cut. This tax cut is going to be all personal income. It's not going to be a corporate income tax cut at all. And doing it this way will produce kind of a hegemony for my regime that will allow us to do corporate tax cuts later on. So you're going to have to just kind of stick with us on this, even though in this first tax cut, that's going to be like the signature domestic piece of legislation of my first term, you are not going to get what you want out of it. And business says, okay, we trust you. And then actually things basically go according to plan. The Bush tax cuts pass, and then he uses his political capital to push corporate taxes in both his first and second administration.
Amazing. So this is fascinating. I love the retelling of the last 30 years through the prism of the Republican Party, because it's a very turbulent story, even though with Bush, I mean, the left, because of Iraq, and because of, what the policies in the Middle East consisted in, like you said, imperial adventures, we have a very different perception of George Bush's. I mean, I remember actually, in a very ironic sense, before 9/11 in 99, 2000, when he ran against Al Gore, correct me if I'm wrong, but even the American Muslim community voted for George Bush.
Yes. Yeah. Muslims are very positive on Bush. He was very good at a kind of multicultural republicanism
Right.
that today seems basically extinct.
Totally, yeah, with Condoleezza Rice and Colin
Mm-hmm.
Powell, and he
Yep.
had a kind of neoconservative, pre-DEI, meritocratic kind of
Yes. Yes.
message that was, yeah, like you said, kind of cooperative, not as extreme as Gingrich and so on. So
Yep.
that's certainly not how we
And
remember him, but
just on that topic, like Bush also really didn't like the old segregationists in the party. Remember when Strom Thurmond
oh yeah.
famously or when Trent Lott gave the speech for Strom Thurmond, where he kind of celebrated Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat presidential run in '48. Bush, Trent Lott called up Bush and said, "I need you to stand with me here," and Bush said, "I'm not going to do it." Right? Like he didn't really like that wing of the party very, very much at all.
Mhm. Well, at the same time, this kind of acerbic and sort of backbiting form of politics still lives under the surface, and Karl Rove is
Hmm.
still a kind of operative that is utilizing a lot of these Gingrich style tactics, I think. And how does campaign finance reform around this time
Hmm.
change things, change
Yeah.
the landscape? We have the 2008 crash.
Hmm.
How, since your book is tracking the kind of consolidated business class, how does the business class respond to the 2008 crash?
Hmm.
Were you surprised in your research and findings in that regard, or was their response as you expected it to be to the 2008 crash?
Yeah, business's response was more or less as expected. They wanted a bailout, right? Like that's what business wanted after the crash. What was really interesting was the Republican Party's response, which was, "We're not going to give it to you." And this, I think, is rooted in a number of things. one of which is the disaster that Iraq became for the Bush administration. 2006 is a historic sweep in the midterms. Bush is a lame duck in a profound sense by that point. And basically, by 2006, 2007, 2008, no Republican wants to really be identified with the Bush administration. It's seen as a failure and a disaster. And so when the financial crisis hits and the Bush administration says, okay, we are going to do this bailout of the financial system, it's what's needed right now. There will be an economic apocalypse if we don't do it. Congressional Republicans just don't listen. Bush calls every member of the Texas delegation to personally ask them to vote for the bailout, and none of them switch their votes. Right? It's just this extraordinary moment of party fracturing. And so what happens is they initially vote down the bailout. The stock market crashes like never before. And that gets enough of them to switch that it passes. But still, a majority of Republicans vote against it. So it's this moment of profound alienation of the Republican Party from what basically all of business actually wants.
Amazing. And wow. So Obama enters into the picture, and we should introduce this kind of concurrent process which is happening on the Democrat side of what we call realignment of the kind of class affiliation of Democrat voters moving to the wealthy on the one hand, and of course it should also be said that this whole question, once we introduce Trumpism and the rise of Trump as a figure who uniquely captured the working class vote, you reject that thesis, right? Or you sort of are you problematize that thesis, which we will get to in a moment. But so keeping with our chronology though, so Obama's here in the wake of the big crash. How does Obama reform the Democratic Party, or how is he incapable of reforming the Democratic Party? We know already that the tactics used against Obama over his 2 terms mirror the Gingrich tactics of obstructionism and incivility and stuff like that. And of course, the everyday popular kerfuffles or dramas during the Obama period are so minuscule. Like the most, what was it? The tan suit that he wore that created some huge. So all of those things are quite innocent now compared to what we deal with on a day-to-day basis with Trump. But tell us about Obama's Democratic Party. And I feel like it's a story of well, it's a tragic story in a certain way, especially given that he enters into office with such high idealism.
Yeah. So, since the late kind of Clinton administration, there had been an ambition in the Democratic Party among kind of elite Democratic circles of winning over kind of the affluent middle class, professionals, etc., as kind of a more reliable base for the party than the workers who Clinton won like non-college voters by a huge amount, right? Clinton crushed with those people. But there was some discomfort with that voting bloc in the party, and Neil Meyer has written very well about this. He has an article in the journal Catalyst that traces this history very, very well. Of this ambition of replacing kind of the working class base of the party, and under Obama, that doesn't quite happen. Obama, is still winning non-college whites, for example, but it is the foundations are dissolving in some sense. It's getting weaker, and the orientation on kind of professionals, etc., is growing stronger and stronger under Obama, I would say. Obama, I would say, kind of doesn't reform the Democratic Party, essentially. He keeps it on a path it had been on since the Clinton administration of kind of moving close to business. And one of the kind of initiatives that Obama does undertake in terms of changing the place of the party in kind of the political economic ecosystem, is this alliance with big tech, that it partially happens through the national security apparatus. I mean, basically, under Obama, leading tech companies start to get really concerned about Chinese espionage and industrial espionage. And this forms the basis for a real partnership with the administration, in addition to like their participation in like the NSA spying on American citizens and things like that. So Obama and that alliance had started to be built under the Clinton administration, but Obama takes it to a whole new level at a moment when these tech companies are now, at the very top of the Fortune 500. Like, you look at Clinton loved the tech companies, but you look at their place in American capitalism in the late 90s, it's just a completely different world from 2010 or 2012, right? So I think that's how to understand what happens with the Democrats under Obama. At the same time, as you mentioned earlier, there are these other institutional transformations happening, most notably Citizens United and the Speech Now Supreme Court decisions, which create the legal foundation for super PACs as organizations that can solicit and spend unlimited amounts in campaign finance.
And which also allow a billionaire to bankroll a single individual's run in a primary, of a national primary.
Yeah. And that plays out in 2012 when like Sheldon Adelson just bankrolls Newt Gingrich's kind of last hurrah in politics with his primary campaign. There was no reason for Gingrich to be in the race. He had no support, but he had Adelson's millions backing him up, and so he stayed in the race for quite a while and actually inflicted some real damage on Mitt Romney that came back in the general. I mean, it was Gingrich who first started talking about Bain Capital and how terrible it was, and the Democrats then picked it up and ran with it.
So I feel as if now we should move to the rise of Donald Trump in 2016 and just kind of lay out as a reminder to folks, because I think this history is pretty fresh for so much of us. And I think, obviously, for a lot of younger people, like, I teach and you meet younger people, and like, these moments, 2016, Donald Trump's victory, 2020, those are like real politicizing moments in people's lives, you know? And so I think it's important to have like a sort of sober and kind of clear analysis of what the preconditions were for this kind of monstrosity to enter in and be so successful. You say in the book that initially it was just a branding exercise, and Trump was planning on not winning. And he was even, I think you said he had organized a vacation that obviously he didn't need to go on because luck was in his favor. Tell us about how Trump is able to benefit from the sort of system as he encountered it in 2016, right, as he's coming into it.
Yeah. So I think the greatest thing that aided Donald Trump was that the Republican Party had become divided between an establishment wing represented by people like Karl Rove and basically the Tea Party wing represented by people like Ted Cruz. And behind this was the fracturing of American business. You had the rise of the Koch network as this kind of alternative fundraising ecosystem to groups like the Chamber of Commerce, right? And these groups are basically at war with each other. The Chamber of Commerce is on Karl Rove's side, and the Koch brothers are on the Tea Party side. And this warfare really goes throughout the Obama administration after 2010, when the Tea Party really kind of burst on the scene electorally.
No, you're right. I forgot to mention the Tea Party. It's so essential to the story of your book. So before we get to Trump, let's make a pivot back to the Tea Party and talk about its emergence in 2009, 10?
Yeah. Yep.
Early.
Yes.
And it's such a paradoxical movement. People, I still can't tell if it's astroturfed or not. Like, it's obviously some combination of a kind of authentic, I guess from Marxist lens, authentic petty bourgeois set of complaints and so on. I don't see its demands or its kind of political imagination to be from the standpoint of working class demands myself.
Certainly not.
Right. But so what is first? Yeah, what is this Tea Party movement? Why is it so important here? It's extremely
Yeah,
important,
so
actually.
you mentioned Trump's campaign as a branding exercise. The Tea Party is also essentially a rebranding exercise for the Republican Party, whose brand was, as one Republican representative said, if our party was a dog food brand, you'd take it off the shelves in 2009, in the wake of Obama's victory. And the Tea Party arises as this attempt to rebrand the party, basically. And in terms of this question of authenticity, I think the sociologist Clarence Lowe has a great formulation when he said there's basically two phases of the Tea Party. And the first is this totally from above kind of attempt in the first like 6 months of the Obama administration to produce an opposition that you can trace all of the events that were organized back to established political operatives, etc. And then after that, it gets rolling and has a genuine kind of popular component to it of people organizing on their own. Um, and what's striking, I think, about this is that Republican renewal after the Bush administration can't come from within the party itself. It has to come from this kind of extra party social movement. And so I think that speaks to the kind of theme of party weakening I've been talking about, that like the resources of party renewal are external, not internal. Um, at the same time, it leads to the Tea Party is also essentially the coming out party for the Koch network of fundraisers, which had been developing, but in the early 2010s just explodes in terms of the amount of money from capitalists that it is raising. It starts to rival the Chamber of Commerce and the NRCC in terms of its scale.
And for listeners that may not be totally clear on what the Tea Party is, what would you define as its like the main plank? Like, like I think you
Yeah.
maybe you made a comparison to like Occupy, like later
Hmm.
in the Obama
Yeah.
period,
Yeah.
right? Once Obama's promises to the millennials
Hmm.
kind of fell apart, well, we had
Yep.
Occupy Wall Street.
Yep.
And that was encapsulated through 1% versus the 99%, and economic inequality needs to
Hmm.
be recentered in politics
Yep.
because standard mainstream politics doesn't care about this issue.
Yep.
What's the sort of slogan of the Tea Party? Is there a clear slogan?
So initially, the Tea Party is really a reaction to proposals that were coming from within the Democratic coalition of bailing out homeowners who were facing eviction and whose mortgages who were underwater on their mortgages, etc. The Bush bailout of the financial industry had already happened. Obama, very early in his presidency, passes his stimulus bill, and what was being talked about then was some kind of aid for homeowners who had gotten these mortgages and then the bubble popped and were in this absolutely disastrous financial situation. And the Tea Party really organizes initially as opposition to any aid to homeowners. So you get these like astroturf websites that are like rentersagainstbailout.com that are like, I'm a renter, why should I pay for some homeowner's mortgage bailout? And you trace like the URLs and the registration on these things, and they're all linked to like political operatives and groups. There's some very funny reporting at the time of kind of detective work on these kind of websites. And so that is the initial kind of spur to the Tea Party. As Obama shifts to healthcare reform, they also then shift to opposition to Obamacare. This is where you get the Sarah Palin death panels and all of that kind of stuff.
So there, so
Right.
the Tea Party's slogan is I don't know, the middle class. What is like it's so the concept of like a cuckold. It seems like the whole structure of the Tea Party is like that. It's like a anti-democratic defense of ruling class interests or
Hmm.
something like that.
Hmm.
It's hard because I feel as if its outward presentation is often mystified because you have figures like Glenn Beck,
Hmm.
and he is this sort of Tea Party intellectual, I don't know,
Hmm.
rabble rouser. and he was trying to reconceive of like the civil rights movement along this kind of Tea Party,
Hmm.
worldview.
Yep. Yep.
So like again, what is the Tea Party worldview? Is it just like a kind of petty bourgeois reaction to the perception that of progressive Obamaism, and is that sort of what it is? Like, it's very strange to me, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair description. And in fact, some of the best scholarship on the Tea Party by like Theda Skocpol and Vanessa Williamson, what they find is they go out and they interview all these Tea Partiers, and they find that they are older white Americans, many of whom can trace their involvement in politics back to Barry Goldwater, and right, like we're going back to the Birchers in some ways here, right? And so the Tea Party is made up of generally older Americans with long established presences in conservative politics and extremely conservative politics in many cases that essentially organize to oppose Obama and renew republicanism in Obama's first term. I think that's a kind of fair description of the Tea Party. And their worldview is, I mean, Tea Party organization and mobilization is, like I said, really oriented on questions of social policy and that kind of
Yeah,
thing. But like
yeah,
what Skocpol and Williamson find, and what subsequent studies have found when they interview folks, is like there's a lot of ethno-racial resentment
right.
also that is
Beneath the
powering the
surface.
whole thing.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
Maybe not outward, but it's sort of latent. It's kind of there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Yep.
now no. So how do you see Trump? Like we talked kind of about the organizational context of the Republican Party that made
Mhm.
Trump possible. Say a little bit about that, but also say a little bit about your claim that we can't understand Trump as purely driven by the racial resentments of
Yeah.
the white working class.
Hmm. Hmm.
You say that, and you also have some interesting things to say about Donald Trump's relationship to the broader working class. And
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your analysis on those points,
Hmm.
please.
So, if you look, like I said before, I think Trump's rise is a product of the division of the Republican Party and the fact that Rove and the Tea Party wings were at each other's throats, and Trump is able to come in and kind of sidestep that whole division and give a very different pitch for republicanism, one that actually totally backs off on the kind of austerity economics that the party had embraced. Right? Trump famously says he's going to leave Social Security and Medicare alone, and embraces the ethno-racial resentment part front and center. And that proves to be a very popular combination among the Republican electorate. He basically cashes in on the potential that like Skocpol and Williamson found in the Tea Party before, and seen that like this kind of resentment politics were really everywhere beneath the surface. Trump brings all of that to the surface to an extent. Yet, I don't think that is. I think that's a good explanation of why he wins Republican primaries. Is that combination? I don't think it's necessarily a great explanation of why he wins the general election, because if you look at like, yeah, you're talking about like working class white voters. The Democrats had been losing working class white voters kind of steadily over the past couple decades. And Trump is not an inflection point in that process. He's a continuation of that trend, right? He benefits from it, right? It benefits him that this has been happening and continues to happen, but he doesn't accelerate it. And I don't think he accelerates it in any real way. Um, and so I don't think it's the case that and on the kind of racial resentment kind of thesis, I just think it's important to recognize that the U.S. in 2016 was a lot less racist than the U.S. of the 1990s. Like in the 1990s, you had huge, a substantial portion of Americans in the 1990s believed at least some point in their life that interracial marriage was wrong. You know, like there are a huge number of people who were alive, were adults in like the 1940s, and were alive in the 1990s, right? By 2016, that's much less true. And this is confirmed by like studies of the kind of trajectory of racial resentment and opinion polls and things like that. Like actually the US got less racist. Trump consolidated support from racists in a way that was as extreme as any Republican ever had. But that's not enough to explain his victory. Actually, what explains Donald Trump's victory in 2016 fundamentally was that he was seen as quite moderate on economic issues. He was not seen as an extremist at all, and I think that is why he is able to win. And there's some good work on the place of like factory closures, going back to
Right.
globalization and that whole
Right.
story in Trump's victory, and like key counties that kind of powered his switch. Places where factories had closed went for Trump. Um, and
So
so,
does that
so,
mean
so,
that do you then disagree with like a figure like Ezra Klein, who
uh-huh.
who you remember uh numerous times would argue that really we can't understand the rise of Trumpism through the prism of economic anxiety?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite right. Right. Hey, oops, sorry, my dog's barking.
You don't think that's right?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite right. No, I think uh, if you want to look in, let's say, the aggregate at
Yeah.
like opinion polls, you might have a hard time finding it. But again, you start looking at like the specific counties that flipped Trump in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, these key states that he won, right? Um, that's where you start to see that the place of economics is pretty unavoidable in
Yeah.
explaining his victory, I think.
So Trump wins the narrative of the primary, how all of that happened. Ted Cruz was a number two,
Hmm.
and Jeb Bush was there, and he was very embarrassingly underperformed, even though the establishment was fully behind him. So Trump is in power. Talk about how this new era of chaos is now unleashed.
Hmm.
What's distinct about the chaos of the Trump period? Does it mirror, or is it at all similar to the Gingrich period? Um, Again, one of the interesting things you note, and this is a kind of structural reality of the Republican Party, is that the Republican Party, I think in 2024, did not draw up a party strategy document or vision document. It just relied on whatever Donald Trump's whims may be.
Hmm.
That's incredible. To have a fully this huge, massive party apparatus to be that um I don't know, sort of open to capture.
Hmm.
It's I mean, again, I'm thinking of like I mean, we could only wish that the Democratic Party was like that for socialism, you know?
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? It would be a real
Yeah.
blessing for us because we could find a way to throw, and one of the concepts you use in your book is personalism
Hmm.
and
Yep.
the personalist and you point out that this is actually very new. This capacity that Donald Trump has to exert his personalist, and that's why, incidentally, for me, in a book that I recently wrote and in other articles, I compared Donald Trump to a Bonapartist figure out of
Hmm.
Marxist theory because of
Hmm.
the personalist dimension. So, talk about the kind of character of Donald Trump's unique, sort of chaotic form of governing. What's how it has continuity with Gingrich and how it breaks from that, perhaps, and
Yeah.
also the personalist dimension.
Yeah, I think the personalist dimension is really, really central. There have been presidents in American history before who stood above party to a certain degree, people like Abraham Lincoln and FDR, who had this kind of direct relationship to the electorate that in a sense wasn't mediated by party, right? That they managed to build. Trump goes so far beyond that in his dominance of the Republican Party. I mean, Lincoln and FDR both famously encountered tremendous resistance from within their own party, right? But Trump is completely dominant in his second term, in particular, over his party. And I think this is at the root of a lot of the chaos, in that Trump governs in a way that no Republican has before, through personal caprice, right? Like, you take something like the child separation policy of the first Trump administration. Um, he pushes that on his Department of Homeland Security because he wants to look tougher, and he wants them to move faster. And the Department of Homeland Security says, we don't have the logistics to accomplish this, and this is going to be really bad, and it's not going to work. And he says, I don't care, do it. And then it turns into a complete disaster for the administration. It looks terrible for them, and they have to reverse it. Basically any prior president, when their administrators say, we can't do this policy, it will not work, would say, okay, we can't, like, we're not going to do it then. No, Trump says, I don't care, just do it. And that both results in the kind of terrifying anti-democratic attacks of the administration, as well as, I think, many of its vulnerabilities. And that, I think, is at the root of this chaos. Like take the Liberation Day tariffs, for example. We
Right.
know that they devised the formula for tariff rates with a simple equation they got off ChatGPT. Like there's this level of like, well, I don't care, we're just going to do it, whether or not we have a good plan, whether or not it's thought out. And Trump's personalist rule is what makes that possible. In his first administration, there was actually quite a bit of pushback from elements of his administration. Like John Kelly, his chief of staff, at various points was like, they have a meeting, and Trump and Kelly would walk out of the meeting with various other officials and say, okay, everything Trump just told you to do, you are not going to do any of that, right? Well, that's not happening anymore in his second term. And so the chaos has become even more intense, right? Like the chaos of the Liberation Day tariffs, I think, exceeds anything from his first term, short of January 6th, basically. So yeah, this, Trump's impeachment was itself, his first impeachment was a result of this kind of personalism, in that he goes to the president of Ukraine and says, look, I want to make a deal with you. I'm going to hold this money that Congress has appropriated hostage to getting this deal. And that's ultimately what leads to him being impeached.
Right.
So yeah, I think the personalism is the foundation of the chaos. And that is qualitatively different from anything Gingrich brought to the table, I think.
I appreciate that. And you do quote Mike Davis, the great late Marxist historian, in your book a couple of times. And one of the things he did was always track. He wrote a few essays on this that I benefited from, of Trump's unique relations and alliances with the capitalist class.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe say a few things about that? Like, how does Trump relate to the Chamber of Commerce community,
Mm-hmm.
big business, and what, like, I've had Clyde Barrow on my show, who's argued in a
Mm-hmm.
very interesting book that Trump is a kind of Bonapartist figure in a
Mm-hmm.
Marxist sense, precisely because he unites elements of the finance aristocracy with the lumpen proletariat,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that Napoleon III did. So talk about, yeah, Trump's alliance to the capitalist class,
Mm-hmm.
because like there's the personalist thesis, right? But then, well, then how does he embody or sort of implement the interests of the capitalist class? Because you did
Yeah.
say, I think, the first term, right? In you mentioned that he allows for certain failures to happen, and then by default, congressional Republicans kind of implement what they
Mm-hmm.
were going to do anyways in a certain
Yeah.
way. So he sort of
Yeah.
fails, and then they clean up
Mm-hmm.
after him.
Yeah.
So I guess there's that question, yeah, like what elements there, and like also within the personalist thesis, is there any method to the madness, or is it really more just kind of like a decapitated madness?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of Trump's relations to capital, neither of the two wings of the kind of financial networks of the GOP back Trump. The Chamber of Commerce doesn't like Trump in 2016, and the Koch brothers do not like Trump in 2016. And essentially, even as it becomes clear that Trump is going to be the winner, neither of those groups opens up their wallets for him. Some kind of Republican mega donors do. Sheldon Adelson, again, the Mercers, who were really important funders of the Tea Party, and Ted Cruz, they get behind Trump. Various figures in the Republican financial aristocracy do get behind Trump. But if you look at it kind of class wide, the main dynamic is capital being alienated from Trump and swinging behind the Democrats in 2016, 2020, and 2024. In all three
Wow.
of those elections, the
Wow.
capital goes to the Democrats. They do not trust Donald Trump. Now, there are, of course, a number of extremely rich individuals who support Trump.
Right.
Who are very, very important to him. And that cast of characters changes somewhat over time. But as a whole, the capitalist class is alienated from Donald Trump, not attracted to him. There is a way in which what happens in 2016 is kind of interesting. The Republicans are like, the Republican donors are like, look, we are not going to win the presidency with this guy. This guy's terrible. It's a nightmare from which we hope to awake soon. So the best thing we can do is juice the Senate races. Make sure we are pouring huge amounts of money to make sure that Hillary Clinton has a Republican Senate after she's elected, and we'll get things there. And there's some evidence that actually Trump rides the Senate campaign's coattails in 2016, that like that money ends up indirectly helping Trump, even though it was donated in the first place because they thought he was such a disaster. So the story of Trump's election in 2016 is the story, I think, of many happy coincidences for him, right? That lets him squeak out this victory with a few tens of thousands of votes in exactly the right places. But so then in 2020 and 2024, you see this continued, the capitalist class as a whole does not like Donald Trump. They do not support Donald Trump. In 2024, what you see is a couple extraordinarily rich donors playing an unprecedentedly central role in Trump's financing. So
Musk
Elon
being
Musk,
one of them. Yeah.
Musk being the biggest of them, but also like the Uline family, who are a far right manufacturing concern based in Wisconsin, who provided a lot of the money for the Stop the Steal legal efforts in the wake of 2021. Just a few people donate a huge amount to Trump's campaign in 2024. The political scientist Adam Bonica, who tracks campaign finance, showed that the top 400 donors to the Trump campaign in 2024 provided more than 60% of that campaign's total money. And prior to 2024, the most it ever was 30%. So on the one hand, business as a whole is saying we do not want Donald Trump, but this very, very small slice of the ultra rich are willing to donate absolutely astounding amounts of money that make up for that lack of more class-wide support among business. And then I think in Trump's second term, what we've seen even more than his first term is the cultivation of a deeply clientelist relationship to American capital, this kind of transactional politics and naked quid pro quos. And so like Bezos, Zuckerberg, all of these types that you saw at Trump's inauguration, none of them supported him during the campaign.
Right.
Absolutely none of them. It
But
was
they
just
flipped on
Musk.
a dime.
Yep.
Right.
Yes, as soon as he won and made it clear that pay to play was going to be the rules of the game, they all say we can live with that. And I think that goes back to the kind of thesis about the fracturing of capital, because this maintains a disorganized state for American capital, right?
Yeah.
They approach the Trump administration as individual firms seeking deals, not as a class presenting demands and a class-wide agenda to the president, right? So, like most of American capital hates the Trump tariffs, absolutely hates it. But if you look at the lawsuits in the Supreme Court about overturning the tariffs, you're not going to find any of the big corporations there. You're going to find these small businesses that are the ones that are never going to be able to strike a deal with the administration. They're too small. So for them, a kind of more frontal confrontation is the only route they have. Whereas for the big companies, you go and you buy Trump a new Rolex, and right, like you can get some kind of giant trade exemption that'll be worth billions to your company.
So, Paul, what's your take on the debate about Trump and fascism? Do you have a clear point of opinion in regards to this debate? I know it's kind of a frustrating debate because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how you slice it as a historian, how you feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people have kind of like a perfunctory, almost like knee jerk response, but perhaps
Mm-hmm.
as what's your take as like a historian? Because I mean,
Yeah, I
obviously that
mean,
like there's like ICE and like what
mm-hmm.
he's empowered ICE to do
Yeah,
clearly has the trappings of a kind of fascistic,
totally.
right?
Yeah.
Paramilitary.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard to deny. But
Yes.
on the big picture, historically speaking, does Trump qualify as a fascist figure?
To me, the debate in some ways hinges on what you think the value of the concept of fascism is. And for me, I think the value of the concept of fascism is not about a certain kind of reactionary ideology or violence or level of repression or that kind of thing. To me, the value of the concept of fascism is about this kind of constitutional collapse and replacement with a party state. Right, like that's what you see in the classic fascist regimes, right? You see the collapse of a given constitutional order, and by collapse I mean collapse, right? Like it's not like there's like a slow period of transition in which the old constitution fades away. Within a year or two of these regimes coming to power, the old constitutional order is basically entirely dead, right? Um, and it's replaced by this kind of mass mobilization state that is all about the fusion of party and government, right? And to me, that's what's useful about the concept of fascism, because when it comes to like kind of counter-revolutionary ideology and mobilization and violence and repression, those are very common features across the history of capitalism. I think so. And you probably have some sense of where I'm going with this, in that I don't think fascism is a terribly useful kind of social scientific term for understanding the Trump administration. I think there are certainly all kinds of parallels between Trump and the Third Reich, and in various kind of authoritarian fashions. Not least of which the kind of personalist chaos I was alluding to is something that typified the Nazi regime. The concept of that Ian Kershaw has advanced, of the centrality of working towards the Fuhrer in the Nazi regime, of kind of trying to like anticipate Hitler's will and get his attention through these various initiatives that resulted in all kinds of bureaucratic confrontations and snarls between different elements of the regime. I think you could apply that concept productively to the Trump administration, I
Right.
think. But at the same time, uh, like the American constitutional order has not collapsed,
Right.
and it looks like, if I had to predict, that there's going to be a very strong Democratic majority in the House of Representatives this time next year.
Mhm.
Right, and so for me, I see a really strong distinction there, in that, like, like, look, in Nazi Germany in 1934, or fascist Italy in, let's say, 26, right? um there was no room for normal oppositional politics. It was impossible. It could not be done, right? Like, you couldn't just run in elections against the regime. And yet, in the United States, I actually think that is the most important kind of next step. Like winning a congressional majority that will kick out the Republicans, I think is a crucial step towards being able to put a muzzle on the Trump regime and control it in some way. So that's to me where I think the kind of fascist thesis goes astray in
Yeah.
that, like, actually, like, our work in the United States is still the work of normal politics in many ways, and that includes, direct action and citizen mobilization of the kind that we saw in Minneapolis to fight back and resist repression, right? But it also includes just running in elections. Like, that's a got to be a central part of the project of fighting Trumpism.
Right.
Um,
Whereas
and
whereas in a
so,
fascist whereas in a fascist regime, that would be foreclosed, that would be denied
yeah,
to the
yeah,
people.
it's
Right,
it's
right,
completely
right,
impossible. Guerrilla
right.
warfare is your only option, right?
Okay,
Or underground resistance of various sorts, and that's just
right,
not where we're at. I like,
right.
look, I won't pretend that I haven't been shocked by the level of savagery of the second Trump administration, the level of violence, of pure contempt for civil liberties, democracy, the Enlightenment, right? Anything of that sort. Like it has been shocking. And so I don't want to say that, like, I don't want to say, like, in 2 years or 3 years, we absolutely won't be at a place where we are not in a where normal politics is no longer kind of a key element of resistance strategy. I don't want to claim to have a crystal ball, but um, I, I don't see that coming in the near term. And I think a focus on that can be misleading as to what the key political tasks of the moment are.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that, Paul. I have a final question about how your research into the Republican Party over the last 30, 40 years may have given you ideas, maybe it hasn't,
Mhm.
into the future of socialism in America, of
Mhm.
socialist politics, and the possibility of that happening within the Democratic Party, how you assess that,
Yeah.
and also how
Yeah.
you assess the possibility of the construction of a socialist
Mhm.
party along the lines
Yeah.
of the Debsian
Mhm.
historical version.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of discussion here within DSA on my
Mhm.
program about the clean and the dirty break and all of this, and
Yep. Yep.
how a lot of us are talking about how we need to get out of the framework of kind of making socialism synonymous with left populism and kind of learning
Mhm.
from the limitations of the Sanders moment.
Mhm.
How might you speculate on that? I know it would be speculation. And obviously there's some, also maybe you could identify in your answer some of the barriers. That would just
Mhm.
be just as helpful to identify some of the barriers to the construction of a third party, of a socialist party.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think the way to think about this is that the weakness of political parties in the United States actually makes for a very strong two-party system. And it is precisely because the parties are weak and cannot control that whether challengers emerge within them. Like, like, look, the Democratic Party of New York did not want Zoran Mamdani on the ballot, right? But they couldn't do anything about it. He entered the primary and he won. And so, like, because in the United States, parties don't control their own ballot lines, like, they can't stop the opposition from mobilizing against them from within. At the same time, what that means is that, look, if you're a figure like Mamdani, why would you run as a third party person? You can win within the Democratic Party as a third party. If he had run on a third party, I doubt he would have gotten 10% of the vote in the election, right? So, and you combine that, then you combine the fact that the parties are open to challenge within with the fact that the legal obstacles to third parties in the United States are, to an extent, not found outside of authoritarian regimes in the rest of the world. Like, the fact that, like, there are different standards to get on the ballot for
Right?
third parties versus Democrats and Republicans is unheard of in the rest of the democratic world. Right? Like, laws like that, the kind of laws that are absolutely standard in every state in the United States, are laws that are explicitly condemned by the democratic kind of guidelines of, like, the European Union and other bodies. Like, the idea that, like, parties operate by different sets of laws in terms of how they're able to get on the ballot it's totally accepted in the United States, and it's insane, right? So, like, on the one hand, it is easier to challenge the parties from within in the United States because the parties are weak, and on the other hand, it is harder to challenge the parties from without. And both of those developments are actually new since the Debsian party. When Debs was building the party, primaries were just being institutionalized. They were just starting to being institutionalized. And the ballot restrictions that we see basically came in response to the success of the socialist and then communist parties in the teens, 20s, and 30s in the United States. So I actually think it is the ways that the American political system have changed partially in response to the success of the Debsian party make a repeat of that same pattern of institutional development unlikely today.
Ha. Wow. So, okay, so then one could respond to your argument by saying that, well, or by posing a question, which is yes, they may be weak and internal takeover may be possible in theory. But when we look at the historical record of AOC to the squad to maybe some would say critical of Mamdani, even though it's early, we see a strange ideological kind of constriction take place
Mhm.
on candidates within the Democratic Party. And I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist about that. I think that um, there's obviously a lot of exceptions to that, but there also is a kind of ecosystem and a culture that it even goes I would argue there's a paradox here because beyond the weakness of the party, there's also a certain ideological hegemony in a Gramscian sense of a
Mhm.
kind of cultural tendency towards homogeneity and conformity, one
Mhm.
could argue.
Mhm.
And those are real pressures, that
Mhm.
pressure to conformity. How do you assess that pressure to conformity where we become what the sort of generation that is trying to sort of reform the centrist Democrats a little bit more? Does that
Mhm.
feel adequate to the demands of 21st century socialism?
Mhm.
To me, I think it doesn't feel adequate.
Mhm.
Although I fully recognize with full, sober eyes your point in regards to how difficult it is to start a third party. So I know it's a real conundrum. But I guess my question is what do you say about the pressure to conformity, even amongst left populists and
Yeah.
socialists in the Democratic Party?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
say to that?
I I don't think it's primarily ideological. I don't think it's primarily a question of people's ideas changing once they reach a certain kind of institutional context. I think it's mainly a reflection of the balance of forces within the party. And that, like, look, while we may win certain elections here and there, the left is not in control of the Democratic Party. The overwhelming bulk of the party is still run by these centrists. And in order for people who we elect as leftists to achieve any of their goals, if we think that like we want to elect people to office for them to actually achieve something in terms of legislation and influence, and not just to raise the flag for socialism. Like, if you think the only point of electing people is to raise the flag for socialism, then fine. Once they're elected, they can do whatever they want, and it doesn't matter if they win or lose or have any influence. But if you think someone like Mamdani, if you think you want him to pass legislation, right? We want him to achieve real reforms. That necessitates some kind of relationship with the rest of his party, right? Like there's just no way to avoid that. That's a question of the balance of forces. And I think the question is like, how can we build a movement that is strong enough that changes that balance of forces, right? That changes that makes it so that there are like I think like electing more socialists to the New York State Assembly is part of the way that we make it so Zoran doesn't have to compromise with Kathy Hochul in the same way, right? And that's not to say that there's like no criticism of the compromises that he makes, and some of them may be right and some of them may be wrong. I'm totally open to that, but I do think the fact that he has to compromise with Hochul is just a fact of his position as an executive in a system in which mayors have much less power than governors. You
Mm,
know, um,
mm,
so so I I think the compromises that people make stem above all from the balance of forces and the fact that socialists are still extremely weak in the American political system. And the only solution to that is to get stronger, right? Like there's not, it's not a question of like the moral rectitude or the revolutionary rectitude of various people. Like the choice is either you want to throw up the red flag when you're in office, or, and in which case you say, I don't care about my influence in the party, or you want to deliver something while trying to maintain a kind of a position as a pole decisively to the left of the party's center of gravity. And doing that requires some terms of relationship with the rest of the party. I just think there's no way around that.
I think that's fair. I would probably disagree with you on the point that ideological rectitude and consistency or fidelity to
Mhm.
a socialist principle, yes, it gets sort of rerouted through the balance of forces of the party machine. That's definitely true. But historically, there could be, and DSA could probably do a better job of playing a role of, because one of the things I think we've realized since Mamdani is that socialism no longer has that like Birch Society tainted vision in
Mhm.
people's minds that
Yeah.
it's like,
Yep.
the devil or something like that. No, I actually think
Yep.
things have changed a lot in the world of
Yep.
popular conceptions of
Hmm.
socialism. Now I think the challenge is actually to fortify or sort of build up a cadre of people that would have more sort of long-term commitment to not budging on the Democrats'
Hmm.
centrist agenda.
Hmm.
So, anyways, that's for another conversation. But look, thank you so much for coming on Emancipations, Paul, and thanks for writing this book. It's very, 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 very helpful piece of American history and political history, and I hope you get a very wide readership out of this. What are you working on next?
I think my next project is actually going to be a history of electoral socialism in New York City from Henry George to Zoran.
Awesome.
Yeah, a history of a century and change of socialism at the ballot box in New York City.
Yeah, I was doing some research on this, and the Socialist Party of America ran, well, I think at their height in like 1912, 1911,
Hmm.
they had something like almost 300 mayors nationwide.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Huge.
Huge.
Yeah, the history of municipal socialism in the United States is fascinating.
It's so interesting, yeah.
Yep.
And a lot of these guys, only I was in this Jack Ross has a pretty good book on this called The History of
Hmm.
Socialist Party in America, and he said only one of them was by occupation a businessman. Very interesting.
Yeah,
Anyways,
yeah, yeah. Yep.
all right, comrades, thank you all very much, and until next time.